Regarding war, people who are descended from or descended family of people who actively participated in violent war are not in hell. Regardless of people who claim they aren't and are trying to make those people's lives hell. The French fake nicer, but actually not really nice thing. This is a really difficult one. And not nice. After Gallipoli, through to the here and now, some French people invented one of the most bizarre routines about Australian ANZAC military personnel post-Gallipoli. A large percentage of the personnel who were evacuated from Gallipoli successfully were sent to be stationed elsewhere afterwards during World War I. Including France itself. Personnel who left Gallipoli, in a lot of cases, lost their lives stationed elsewhere before the end of the war. Some French people decided to pretend that a lot more Australian ANZAC personnel were evacuated from Gallipoli alive than is actually the reality of that situation. They decided to pretend the toll in Turkey was lower than the factual numbers and that more personnel were evacuated and travelled to be stationed elsewhere than actually did. Then all died in a different country, not Turkey. Those French people decided to pretend it was somehow a nicer story, or more poignant, to pretend those personnel were alive for longer than they were before losing their lives elsewhere. Instead of being part of the factual much higher fatality numbers in Gallipoli than some French people will quote if asked. They transferred a percentage of the fatalities from Turkey to wherever Gallipoli station troops died elsewhere, including France, and sort of said to themselves in a deluded way that's a little bit nicer story for the friends and relatives. I have never found a way to describe their motivation for it. I don't understand their mindset on it. They decided it was less distressing, or a somehow nicer story for all involved regarding ANZACs to pretend more personnel left Gallipoli than actually did, and then all lost their lives elsewhere shortly afterwards. As if pretending they lived longer than they did made it slightly less horrible for the grieving relatives and friends. It flowed through to memorials with names of deceased ANZACs on them, with the place of death incorrectly listed as post-Gallipoli, elsewhere, instead of Turkey. It must have been motivated by the deliberate incorrect coordinates from the French military thing. As if it is really a deluded attempt to make those in the know who are French make themselves feel better about what happened and have the deceased at Gallipoli ANZAC's friends, family, and military unknowingly play along and pretend it sounds a little bit nicer than the truth. I am assuming that some French people think it is nicer to pretend the ANZACs who died at Gallipoli, that they pretend were evacuated and died elsewhere in a fairer combat scenario. Instead of what was basically a pre-planned ambush war crime-like scenario against the ANZACs in Turkey. It's not nice or nicer is all I can think of to say. Then there is the verbal tactic element that is unavoidable in life. It usually starts with someone bringing up Australian ANZAC fatalities at Gallipoli, Turkey. Then someone usually mentions that personnel evacuated from Gallipoli went on to serve in the military stationed elsewhere, like France and Egypt. Then someone gets around to who died elsewhere after leaving Gallipoli. People are always intellectually nudged to lean towards saying almost all of them died elsewhere after evacuation from Turkey. French lunatics have every little incident where someone stated almost all of them died elsewhere after Gallipoli memoized from every little incident they have ever witnessed since those lies were invented by French people. Every little deflection in sport, for example, where the ball was deflected off a player from a team that said almost all of them died elsewhere instead of Turkey. The truth is it is only some of them died elsewhere. Because they really died in Turkey in much larger numbers. The new Turkish lunatics theory on Gippsland history that is none of their business. Then there is the post-Gallipoli, more recent, fake outrage Turks thing. For reference material on this one, see the chapter called Yarragon City and the Holy Grail. Obviously the Turkish army was contacted before ANZAC troops arrived at Gallipoli and told where to set up weapons and cameras for their ambush at the wrong coordinates. Including techno-telescopic cameras at the time, they probably have them as souvenirs. After World War I, people from Turkey who travelled to Gippsland were made aware of, or readily noticed, very large piles of human bone remains sorted into body parts, skulls, knuckles, etc. Then sorted into genetically similar shapes. A lot of the piles were deliberately arranged to look like old mid-1850 cameras that took minutes per exposure frame, used to photograph Gippsland before 1.5 million homes were destroyed in an arson riot in early 1858, including a city of over 1.2 million people that has never been redeveloped. Because the piles looked like man behind big camera with cape, slightly similar to cameras set up to photograph and film ANZAC's landing at Gallipoli at the wrong coordinates, those Turkish lunatics decided to pretend all the piles that looked like a camera, in particular, were post-World War I piles of Turkish people's remains on display to distress anyone from Turkey, or part Turkish, that travelled to Gippsland for a look at the place. As if anyone who is part Turkish got hunted down after WW1 and added to the piles, which were prominently displayed to distress any visitors from Turkey, or who are part Turkish. A bizarrely large number of Turks would have been required, by the way. That is rubbish, regardless of how vehemently outraged they pretend to be. The piles are all from after the January-February 1858 arson riot. They are the remains of the people involved in the arson riot that completely destroyed around 1.5 million people's homes in Gippsland in 1858. Including the 1.2 million population city of Yarragon in what is now the Latrobe Valley. Crazies who identify with the leaders of the arson riot, all lunatics from a country called Österreich at the time, now Austria, an abbreviated copy of Australia, still pretend the city ruins area is not allowed to be redeveloped until 2147. If you deduct 1858 from 2147, then deduct the result from 1858, you get the year Gippslanders travelling Europe found the artifact nicknamed the Holy Grail and handed it into the Vatican, approximately.